All right, let's give people a few minutes to join, or a few seconds more accurately, and then we will get started. All right, so I am David Worth. I am a professor of law at Boston College Law School. And more importantly, we have today our guest, Dr. Lisa Benjamin from Lewis and Clark Law School, who is our Klaus speaker in the Climate Constitutionalism series. Her presentation today is on impacts of climate change on communities of color in the US and internationally, about which she can speak from her personal experience being involved in the Kyoto Compliance Committee, as well as having represented the Bahamian government in the climate negotiations. So this isn't about me, it's about her. Dr. Benjamin is assistant professor and Lewis and Clark Law School, where she teaches environmental justice, international climate change, energy resources, and administrative law. She and I have shared thoughts on teaching administrative law and the challenges of that just between us. Her research investigates the intersection of corporate, energy, and environmental law with a focus on climate risk and climate justice. She also researches climate change from the perspective of developing countries. She is currently a member of the Compliance Committee, the facilitative branch of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and has been an advisor to and member of the Bahamian National Delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So on behalf of the Climate Constitutional Series of the Klaus Center for Constitutional Democracy at Boston College Law School, Dr. Benjamin, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Just one point before Dr. Benjamin begins her presentation. Please do make use of the Q&A. I will keep track of the Q&A while Dr. Benjamin is speaking, and then she will take questions afterwards. So please do keep her running, send in questions as they occur to you. As she is speaking, she will address the questions and answers at the end. So Lisa, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, David, and the Klaus Center so much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, even if it's virtual, although that's very climate friendly. So there are benefits to virtual attendance. As David has said, I'm going to speak about climate change and the impacts of climate change on communities of color with a focus on the US and internationally, which is my experience as well. So I'm going to speak with you for about 30 minutes, and that will leave us with about 30 to 45 minutes for questions. So please do send in your questions, and I look forward to engaging with you through them. So I'll just share my screen. And I'm just going to run through my slides. A lot of them are pictures. And so for the overview, I'm really going to start a long time ago and with colonial histories in relation to developing countries in particular, or countries in the global south. I'm going to make some linkages to climate change and climate justice and economic justice as well, and how those are related to each other. And then in the second stage of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the impacts of climate change on communities of color, both within the United States and then also internationally. And then I promised David that I would make linkages to the UNFCCC and the regime. And so I'll talk very briefly about that regime and the sort of disparities within the countries. And I will focus really on the G77 and China negotiating bloc, which links quite nicely with the first section on the colonial histories of some of these countries. So as many of you probably know already, climate justice, and when I'm talking about climate justice, I'm including within that environmental justice. So climate justice is really not so much about law. It's really about the history of many of the countries in the global south, colonial histories and neocolonialism today. It's about racial justice and structural disadvantage, which is highly related to issues of economic justice. It's also very related now to human rights. So we've seen a lot of connections between human rights and climate change emerging now, particularly through some of the human rights organizations at the UN. We know that a lot of migration and climate displacement that's happening now is, inspired by climate change. So a lot of the impacts of climate change are driving, at least partially, a lot of the migration both voluntary and forced migration that we're seeing. And then in terms of environmental justice, I'm going to sort of end a little bit at the end of the presentation with some images about people of color, involving people of color and predominantly disenfranchised communities and what they are doing about climate change, because I think image matters. And then in the second part, I'll talk about sort of a little bit of the politics and health impacts of climate change, and the media portrayals of people in relation to climate change, I think is very important. So the first section of the presentation really is about the history of colonialism. Not only was colonialism about exploitation of human bodies, it was also predominantly an economic and extractive system. And so land was taken from communities, including communities in North America, so indigenous communities, and all through Latin America and South America, and on the African continent and in Asia. And this was a trade not just in bodies and led to horrendous human devastation, but it also led to the extraction of raw materials taken by force from countries, predominantly countries in the global north, and sent to what were then sort of centers in the global, taken from the global south and sent to centers in the global north for consumption. And those raw materials were really the fuel for the industrial revolutions that happened in many of those countries. And I want to point out, not only was it appropriation and exploitation of people and natural resources and land, but it was also an appropriation of culture. And so I think when we think about taking of land, we have to think about culture as well. And this is highly related to the impacts of climate change. I look at what's called the non-economic loss and damage from climate change, which is about intangible losses that you can't really put a price tag on. So losses of communities, losses of ancestors that are buried. And those things are really sort of part of come from this idea of colonialism. This is a picture of the Benin bronzes in the British Museum that don't belong in the British Museum. And so this idea of the taking of culture really has, if you see climate protests, you will see protests about colonialism. And this is very much linked to some of those feelings of loss. And so this is an image that I use quite a lot in some of my classes about the really extractive nature of which has fueled a lot of the economies in the global north. And so this is not just historic. And so if we think about some of the projects of the Belt and Road in China, some of the investments that have been made through this that are fossil fuel based and extractive based, this is not happening just in African countries, it's also happening in the Caribbean, where I'm from. And so these ideas of these patterns of extraction and exploitation are still with us today. And so I want to sort of link this history to climate change itself. And one of the impacts, many impacts of some of this history, is that it led to levels of lifestyles and wealth and consumption in the global north, which have really been based upon extraction of raw materials from the global south. And so those levels of consumption that we still enjoy today in the global north are really based on extractions and natural resources that don't exist in the global north. They're fueled by resources that come from the global south. And so as a result, the costs and the impacts, particularly the negative externalities of that consumption and of those lifestyles, are not felt by those predominantly who are wealthy enough to consume them, but the harms are largely experienced by populations in the global south and also environmental justice communities in the United States. And so if we think about fossil fuels and toxic wastes, the sort of negative externalities of this consumption is felt by communities that are sited next to these toxic waste dumps or where the plastic goes, which is in the global south. And so the plastic waste. And so this sort of pattern is old and has been going on for some time. And the patterns of consumption, I think, are really some of the areas that are unspoken about in relation to climate change, and they are very disproportionate. And so really the consumption of energy and metals used in the world today are predominantly consumed in the West and the East. And those high levels of consumption are really fueling a number of crises that we're experiencing, not just the climate crisis, but the crisis of biological diversity, which is happening at the same time. And those lead to pretty horrific relationships with each other. So this is just a graph that I use in relation to global inequality in living standards in today, basically in 2017. And if we look at sort of on the left, the mortality rate of children under 5, it's 12.7% in Somalia and under 1% in Iceland. So that's a huge disparity. Life expectancy, 84 years in Japan, and 50 years in parts of Africa. And then schooling is pretty much the same. So you can see that there's a tremendous disparity in terms of the impacts of partly these environmental issues on countries in the global south. And a lot of this has to do with economic inequality and so economic injustice. And so there's been a lot of wealth creation in the past few decades, but global inequality has expanded as well. And so if we look at the top 1%, and even if you sort of, there's another chart that I use sometimes in my classes, even going down to the sort of top 0.1%, the really ultra wealthy, they are getting richer. And so they're capturing much more of the economic growth as the bottom 50% of the entire population. So while rates vary between countries, there's a lot of global inequality going on. So how is this related to climate change? Not only is it consumption levels, but we know that where you have global economic inequality, those more vulnerable populations, both in the United States and internationally, are going to experience some of the worst impacts of climate change. So countries in the global south in particular, we know the IPCC is an intergovernmental panel on climate change. They have told us in their sort of groundbreaking report, Summary for Policymakers on 1.5 degrees Celsius, that the biggest economic impacts and just physical impacts are going to be felt in the tropics and the southern hemisphere. And so that's largely people in the global south. And even within the global north, it's going to be the most vulnerable and the poorest in the global north that are going to be affected. So the IPCC has told us that 1.5 is going to be bad, and we may not even make it to limiting the increase in temperatures to 1.5, but 2 degrees is going to be so much worse. And so that gap between 1.5 degrees Celsius and a 2-degree increase in mean global average temperatures, while it doesn't sound like a lot, it's going to have a tremendous difference in terms of its impacts. And not only will 1.5 disproportionately affect vulnerable populations like small island states, but also indigenous communities, any communities that are reliant on subsistence living like fisheries and agriculture. Any of those kinds of communities are going to be disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, and it will get disproportionately worse as we increase from 1.5 and onwards. So this is an image that I use sometimes. I often don't like to use this image, but I think it's one of the images that we're most familiar with in terms of people who are suffering from the impacts of climate change. Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas, where I'm from, in September 2019. It's not the first category 4 to 5 hurricane that we have had, but it was one of the worst. And we have in the Caribbean, as well as in the Pacific with typhoons, experienced some of the worst hurricanes in the past 4 to 5 years that we have ever experienced in my lifetime. And this was such a severe storm, and the impacts of the waves were so high and so forceful that people were literally washed out of their homes. We've never found some of the bodies of the people that we lost. People had funerals with empty caskets. The sort of devastation and the psychological trauma, not only of physically losing everything you physically own. So this image shows you that everything is gone. Literally everything is gone. But it's not only that, it's the personal grief and loss of losing so many people in your family. And in the Caribbean, we have extended families. And in small communities and settlements, so many people were affected. And then not to be able to bury the dead was sort of a sort of added grief on top of existing grief. And so we are having more and more of these extreme events. It means that communities have less time to recover between these extreme events. And so it's really, a colleague of mine, Adele, have written about this sort of unvirtuous cycle of loss and damage where you keep continuing to experience these events. You can't recover. The government certainly doesn't have the funds in its public budget to recover. And then you have another event. And so it's just this cycle where budgets are eroded. And psychologically, the harm and the toll is extreme. So this is a blog that I wrote with 2 colleagues in Canada and Dalhousie, and we wrote it in relation to this report that came out about 2 years ago, looking at extreme poverty and climate change. And the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations actually called this nexus, this relationship, a climate apartheid. And I think those words were used specifically to highlight the racial context of these harms and the numbers of people and what those people look like in relation to the escalating impacts of climate change is very important, and it's also very disproportionate. So some of the statistics in the report talked about the increase of 1.5. It could expose several hundred million people to climate related risks. 2 degrees would put an additional 100 to 400 million at risk of hunger, and 1 to 2 billion for inadequate water sources. And then a total of 140 million, and these are estimates, so migration is really difficult to connect and count, could be displaced, and that's in areas of Africa, Asia, and Latin America by mid-century. So the numbers are really staggering, and the numbers at 1.5 are bad, but the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is really enormous. And if we go back to sort of what's fueling this, it's really sort of wealthy populations are really disproportionately responsible for the amount of carbon emissions that we are seeing in the world today. And so the richest 1% in the world are causing double CO2 emissions than the poorest in terms of emissions. And that is very much linked to consumption. If we look at inequity in the United States, a lot of that consumption and air pollution in terms of driving is mainly by white populations, but it's communities of color that are bearing the brunt of the impacts of that, not only from being next to highways, for example, but also living next to polluting factories. And so this is very much environmental justice issues. And that inequity is a racial inequity in terms of consumption of goods and services as well. And so there are definitely sort of racial inflections in relation to how we are using resources and who gets access to those resources. And this is sort of exacerbated and added onto by a study that was published last summer in relation to traffic-related air pollution, or traps. And so we know that highways in the US are sited predominantly either near or through communities of color, and the emissions from those cars on those highways are causing significant health impacts for the communities that live close to those highways. And this study focused particularly on women of color and Black women who were at disproportionately higher risks of the impacts of these emissions during pregnancy, leading to preterm births, low-term births, and stillbirth. And so the impacts of emissions are definitely racialized. These are actually harms that we are passing on to future generations of these communities. And the impacts of these emissions are actually exacerbated by climate change. And so the heat of climate change is pushing these emissions closer to the ground, and therefore they're having much greater impacts on the communities that live next to these highways. And so I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and its relationship to climate justice, because I think this is also highly related to air pollution and the underlying health conditions that are making populations more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19 are highly related to climate and fossil fuel emissions. So we know that COVID-19 is having this catastrophic impact on communities of color, in particular Latino communities, Native American communities, and Black communities. And we knew this right at the beginning of the pandemic, that the impacts of this are multifold. And so that's predominantly because of underlying health conditions in these communities, but also because of the nature of the jobs that they do. And so a number of these community members will be essential workers, so transport workers, for example. Also, in terms of Native American communities, the lack of water and access to resources on reservations was having a disproportionate impact in terms of the spread of COVID-19 within these communities. And there's some similarities between these different events. So between COVID-19, racism, and climate change, a number of them are linked to systemic issues like socioeconomic and structural inequality. And those inequalities have led to a lack of resilience on the in relation to the communities that are feeling the worst effects of these. And so that lack of resilience means that they are not as close to community health resources, or they don't have sort of the ability to work from home, for example, and benefit from social distancing. They have to go out and they have to work, and therefore they are much more vulnerable. And so some of these impacts are what we call in the climate world nonlinear. And so they don't sort of escalate slowly over time so that you can sort of judge where they're going. They will happen almost overnight. So with COVID-19, for those of us who could stay home, March 10th, we were out in the world and traveling. March 20th, we were at home trying to avoid a pandemic. So those are sort of nonlinear, very sudden and abrupt changes. And that is also what we are anticipating from climate change. And of course, with COVID-19, racism, and climate change, there are disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable communities. So Cancer Alley is sort of a classic example of environmental justice community. This is a community where multiple petrochemical plants have been sited around this community, leading to horrendous health impacts. And so this is just from I lost track of time, 2 months ago. This was in relation to a permit to site another plant in Cancer Alley. And so this was the Formosa plastic plant. And of course, plastic is a fossil fuel, leading to more emissions. And so there have been thousands and thousands of letters written to revoke the permit for this plant in this community that's already suffered more than its fair share of health impacts from industrial chemicals, which create all the things that we consume on a daily basis. And so this is just a comparison that I created in relation to the CDC's list of underlying health conditions that make populations more vulnerable to COVID-19. So those are lung diseases, cancer, for example, with immunocompromised systems, obesity, heart conditions, diabetes. And on the left, I've sort of listed some of the impacts of polluting factories. And so that is air pollution in terms of respiratory disease, cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes. And so the impacts of a lot of these emissions are directly correlated with some of the underlying health conditions that make communities much more vulnerable to COVID-19. So all that to say, environmental justice is racial justice. And so they are highly related to each other. We really can't divorce the two because they are both so related to economic and health justice. So finally, just in a few minutes, I want to talk to the UNFCCC process. I'm not going to go through sort of the agreements themselves. I'm just really going to focus on the negotiating groups. And so in 1992, over almost 200 countries agreed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a framework convention that sets out a lot of principles and objectives as to what the world wanted to achieve. And in the decades since then, countries have agreed agreements underneath them. So the Kyoto Protocol is one of the treaties that's been agreed underneath the UNFCCC. So that's like an umbrella convention, and the Paris Agreement is another one. So the main objective of the UNFCCC, and as you can see in the background, it's a highly international set of negotiations. So you have lots of different countries that attend. The objective of the UNFCCC is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. At the time, the parties never defined what dangerous meant. And since then, in the Paris Agreement in particular, we have attached a temperature goal to what we think is dangerous, and that is to keep increases well below 2 degrees Celsius, with an aspirational goal to keep increases in temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So Article 3 is a really important provision in the UNFCCC. And this really speaks to the different obligations historically and responsibilities historically of different countries, and how that historic responsibility was supposed to move parties forward in terms of addressing the impacts of climate change. And so the parties agreed that they would, on the basis of equity, and in accordance with, in bold, I put some of the sort of most important principle in this paragraph. So in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And so what the parties meant by that was that we all didn't contribute equally to the problem of climate change. And we all have different capacities in terms of socioeconomic development to address the problem of climate change. And so this CBDRRC, as we call it in the climate change world, and it has evolved a little bit since this original articulation, really meant, and the parties agreed a sentence afterwards, that developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change. And this has been a very important, but also very contentious principle in the climate world. a lot of developed countries at the time didn't take the lead, and that led to a lot of resentment and problems in developing countries. And I'll talk a little bit about the G77 in China. And this principle has been sort of one of the more difficult ones to really articulate and reflect in some of the agreements post the UNFCCC. There's a constant sort of argument about who is doing enough. And while we argue about that, the impacts of climate change get worse and worse. And so I think the Paris Agreement tried to very faithfully reflect this principle, and obligations are largely differentiated a little bit in the Paris Agreement, but not as strictly differentiated as they used to be in the Kyoto Protocol. And so this is a sort of guiding principle of the parties. And then I want to move a little bit to talking about negotiating blocks. So this is an old image of what the negotiating blocks used to look like pre-1997. And so by negotiating blocks, what I mean is that the UN will have sort of recognized groups of countries that will negotiate together. And they will usually come up with a position that is a position of what's called their bloc or their negotiating bloc. And then they will put that forward. And so you can see on the left, the G77 in China is one of the oldest negotiating blocs. The EU was there as well as the developed countries, the US, Australia, Canada, and some other developed countries. And within the G77 in China, some of the original smaller blocs were the OPEC countries, so oil and gas countries, and AOSIS. And AOSIS is the Alliance of Small Island States. That's the bloc that small island states from the Caribbean and the Pacific use, and the Bahamas is a member of AOSIS. And so that's what the old position sort of looked like. And then if we move on a little bit, a couple of decades later, you can see that it gets a little bit more complicated. And so within G77 in China, we still have AOSIS and OPEC. We also have least developed countries like the LDCs. We have the African group. We have like-minded developing countries. We have the big developing countries, the basic countries. We had ALBA, which is still around, but not as influential as it used to be. And then importantly, the environmental integrity group at the top is a really interesting negotiating bloc, which crosses over developed and developing countries. For the most part, blocs are pretty confined between their members being from the developed world or for the developing world. And the environmental integrity group is one of the exceptions to that. So I show my students this graph. This is from Carbon Brief. It's a great graph. It's interactive, so you can actually click on the negotiating blocks. And what we can see is that things have changed a lot. So there's a lot of different countries. And so there's a lot of different negotiating blocks. And so there are a lot of relationships, a lot of countries overlap. So some members of AOSIS, small island states, will also be members of least developed countries. And so there's some overlap between them, but the picture is pretty complicated because there's a complicated set of interests involved. And so just to very briefly talk about the G77 in China, this was originally the G77. It was called the G77 because there were originally 77 signatories in UNCTAD. And it formed in 1964. And so that was before a number of countries actually became independent from colonialism. You can see that the members are Global South members, so they are developing countries. There are actually much more than 77 countries now, but we still call it the G77. And now we call it the G77 and China because China has joined the group. And the G77 in China is a UN negotiating bloc that is sort of the biggest negotiating bloc for all developing countries. And so all developing countries will be a member of G77 in China. So this is a picture of some of the group meetings of G77 in China. Every bloc meets at least briefly every day in the climate negotiations, including the G77 in China, which may often meet twice a day. So I've been in these meetings. They can often be contentious. It is where you see all the brown and black negotiators, basically, in the G77 in China. It's a big, big set of countries and very, very diverse interests. And so it ranges from the most vulnerable countries, which are the Alliance of Small Island States and the least developed countries, to some of the more wealthy countries like the Arab group, the Saudi Arabias, the OPEC countries. So it's a very, very diverse set of interests. These meetings are very sensitive, and so no one is allowed to take pictures in the room. Your ID is checked. They can actually be very contentious meetings. I've been in a couple of highly contentious meetings. The principle that governs the relationships within this bloc is the principle of do no harm, We try to implement this if we are going to take different positions, and often we do within the smaller blocks within G77 and China. The idea is that the position that we take should try to do no harm to perhaps a different position that a different bloc within G77 and China is taking. You can imagine that it's extraordinarily difficult to come up with a bloc position of G77 in China, but once that position is developed, it's a pretty strong position to go into if you have a consensus outcome from G77 in China. So it's a very interesting group, obviously very varied interests, and difficult to come to that consensus. And so you can imagine that chairing this group can be a very, very difficult task for whichever country is chairing. So although we have this really large G77 in China bloc, this is a picture of the Bahamian delegation and the Paris Agreement. Power and size really matters. So the reason I use this picture is because this was our entire negotiating delegation of the Bahamas for the first 10 days of the Paris Agreement. And the first two people in the front was the head of the Environmental Commission of the Bahamas and the director of the Met Department in the Bahamas. And then is a colleague of mine, Dr. Adele Thomas. She was also at the University of Bahamas with me. And we were basically two academics. And so we went there in a voluntary capacity. Adele is a lead author for the IPCC, voluntary scientist, and I gave legal advice to the Bahamas, the Bahamian delegation. And so without us, the delegation would have been two. And so you can imagine that that is a tiny, tiny delegation. Many blocs send delegations of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 people. So there's no way as a delegation of this size, we could attend all the sub meetings of all the different topics. And so the Bahamas, like many small island states, it's a very tiny population, is highly dependent on AOSIS to put forward our positions because we can't be in all the rooms and we certainly can't be experts in all the different areas of the negotiations because it's complicated and it's vast. So I just want to end with a few images as promised. So this is a blog that was written by my colleague, Dr. Adele Thomas, and Marina Haynes, who's also a negotiating colleague of mine in AOSIS. And they specifically, I highly recommend this blog, they specifically make the link between the Black Lives Matter movement and the climate change movement, really articulating how racial and climate justice are so intertwined with each other. And I also found this story really interesting. So the climate change strikes in the summer of young people, some of the same participants in those school climate strikes sort of learned about protesting through the climate strikes and then applied those protesting skills to the Black Lives Matter movement. So there are actually activist relationships as well between both the climate and racial justice movements. I also wanted to emphasize a little bit about how important image is. And even in the climate world, racial image matters. And so I don't know if some of you remember this incident where I think this may have been Davos or one of those economic meetings where the picture was taken of climate activists and the picture that Reuters used was the top photo. And actually the actual photo is on the bottom. And so they edited out Vanessa Nakate, who's a Ugandan climate activist. And so even the image of the people that you see fighting climate change is not representative of, for example, climate negotiations. And so this issue of racism pervades almost every level of climate change. And so this is a story I'd highly recommend from a Black climate scientific expert talking about how race and racism really takes up so much of her time and just makes life harder, even at a really sort of expert level of a highly qualified participant in terms of climate science. And so I want to end with some positive images because I think that's really important. So this is a photo from Warren County of these two protesters. This is one of the first, often considered the first environmental justice protest in the United States, in North Carolina. And I love this image because I think it reminds us that Black and Brown people have been involved in the struggle for environmental justice for a very long time. And this is a much more recent photo of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And this is a couple of groups in terms of environmental justice and economic justice that I really like. So this is a Fiji group, which is really focused on female-led and island-based solutions to climate change. So very much managing, trying to sort of bring communities together to manage the issue within their own home. This is actually an NGO that a student pointed out to me. It's called No White Saviors. It's a group of women that are based in Uganda. And so they describe what their slogan means in terms of their own adoption and control over development issues within Uganda. And so I think that the idea of a commitment to anti-racist directions and equitable directions within their own country is a really important story of who is sort of fighting. This is a picture of the Swiss Grannies litigation. So a group of older, not old, but older women brought litigation in Switzerland, really talking about the disproportionate impacts to their community, the elderly, in relation to climate change. And so I think this is just a great photo. And this is an NGO based in California, which is queer and transgender Asian and Pacific Islanders that are fighting the impacts of climate change and environmental justice. And then finally, I want to end on a hopeful note. So there's been a dramatic change in relation to climate change and environmental justice in this country through the new administration. This is one of the first executive orders that was issued by the new administration on advancing racial equity through the federal government, which I think is a really important executive order. And then, of course, the climate crisis executive order that was issued a few days later, which is a really sort of eloquent piece of writing in relation to the impacts of climate change. And also talks about international financing and sort of, of course, the rejoining of the United States to the Paris Agreement and what that means in terms of international cooperation for the diffusion of renewable and clean energy. And then finally, every time there was a diverse appointment in the Biden administration, I would highlight it as sort of energy in the news or environmental justice in the news for one of my classes, because I think representative diversity matters. I think it matters a lot. And I think it's really exciting to see some of the really highly talented and diverse appointments that have been made by this administration. And then finally, to end, I would highly recommend this TED Talks by my colleague, Rowena Haynes. She's a climate negotiator in AOSIS with me, and she talks really truthfully about what it means and how difficult it is to be a climate negotiator, and in particular, a climate negotiator from a vulnerable country. So the link is there, and I'd highly recommend it. And that's it. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions.
Great, and we have plenty of time for questions. I see them coming into the Q&A. And the first one, by the way, somebody one time told me after I did this in another context, well, that's the easiest job on the planet, which may be true, but it's also a pleasure, particularly with Lisa Benjamin as the speaker. So the first question is from a Nigerian student. How do you bring about awareness of a populace to this global challenge of climate change in a country where the government does not even acknowledge this problem? It appears to me, by the way, Lisa, you can see this in the Q&As. It appears to me that most sub-Saharan African countries where I am from are dealing with issues of extreme poverty and bad governance, that the issues of climate change is not visible to their daily reality of seeking for the basic necessities of life, food, water, healthcare, shelter, etc. From the conversations I've had with a number of people, climate change seems to be a Western problem, when in fact it is the developing countries that are most adversely affected. So my little comment is not one or the other, but both. And I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and I remember vividly that the average weather temperature in Lagos between 1994 and 2003 was 21 to 26 degrees Celsius. In the last 20 years, the average weather has risen to 29 to 34 degrees Celsius. For those who are accustomed to dealing with Fahrenheit, 34 degrees Celsius is well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. As Lisa is answering the question, let me see if I can convert it to Fahrenheit, but it's a number that is way off the charts. So Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, so I think obviously the situation was much worse in the previous administration. And of course, a lot of what happens in terms of plans around climate change in the United States is very state-based as well. And so even with the change in federal administration in some states, for example, Florida comes to mind, where it's really difficult to even mention the word climate change. But I think what is hopeful, we'll talk about the United States first before we move on to developing countries. I think it's what is very hopeful when I try to remain hopeful about climate change, because I think it's a really difficult area to work in, is that the public attitude around climate change in the US in particular is shifting. It hasn't shifted as much as it is in other parts of the world. So for example, in the Caribbean, I did a study with Adele, and the majority of participants in our study not only believed in climate change, but had a very sophisticated understanding of what it was and wanted the government to actually do something about it. And I think that that consensus in other countries, particularly in the developing world, is shifting because we're experiencing the impacts of climate change so much. And so I think that the consensus is shifting a little bit more in the United States than I have seen it in a long time. And so I think that we can't say anymore the federal government doesn't believe in climate change because the administration has changed. I think for a large percentage of the US population, they do think that climate change is happening. They may not want to pay for the changes that it entails, but I think particularly younger people, and I teach a lot of young people, it's so different in terms of their vision, their perspective and understanding of climate change is so different. So I think that is hopeful. And I think this administration is hopeful, and that does impact the climate negotiations incredibly. In the developing, and so I think the question is really about image, that the really severe impacts from developing countries are not fully understood in the United States or really talked about as much. And I think that's correct. I think that where we see these extreme events happening, you get it a little bit on the news in the US, but it's not really well connected to the impacts of climate change. Or if it is, it's just a brief mention. And so I think that media and representation and news in the United States about climate change should really improve. But of course, news outlets are very different in terms of their perspectives. I think in the developing world, we're pretty clear about the dire impacts of climate change, and what the focus really is adaptation to climate change. And also that now we've actually moved on from adaptation to loss and damage. And that's things you're talking about, like permanent losses and permanent damage that we can't really recover from. I think part of that in terms of the negotiations is pretty sensitive because it has to do with financial assistance, and climate finance is always a really contentious issue between developed and developing countries. But the upcoming COP, one of the focuses of the Conference of Party meetings is on climate finance, which it always is on, but also adaptation. So I think that we've shifted a little bit from mitigation to adaptation, and understanding that all countries have to adapt. It's not just developing countries, but developed countries have to as well. And hopefully with this new administration, it will lead to a lot more changes and positive directions in terms of adaptation and climate finance. So we'll just have to wait and see. So then the other question I think was on the Navajo Nation. Let me just go back to it.
Could I just articulate the question for everybody?
Yeah.
I don't know whether people can see the Q&A or not, but the question is, could you please speak a bit more on the situation of the Navajo Nation at the present moment in regard to climate challenges, COVID-19 protection measures, access to vaccination, and how is the integration of their communities being assured both legally and economically? So the other question dealt with outside the United States. Here we have a community within the United States.
Yeah, so I think as with other communities of color, the Navajo Nation was pretty savagely affected by the impacts of COVID-19. And so from what I had understood, that there were really attempts by the community to close down the reservations and not allow people on the reservations. And some of those communities tried to do that. And there was a lot of pushback in some states about the ability to really isolate themselves. And I think part of the reason why they wanted to isolate themselves so much was because they understood how vulnerable their populations are, not only in terms of underlying health conditions, but also vulnerable in terms of lack of access to water. And so there's a great short documentary. I might not be able to find it in this presentation and put it in the chat, but if the questioner wants to email me, my email's on the website, I'll try and send it to you. I showed it in one of my environmental justice classes just to show the interactions between lack of health resources on the reservation, the need to sort of travel for dialysis and other things outside of the reservation, and the exposure that has for these communities to COVID-19 in terms of leaving, and then just a physical lack of running water and the impacts that has, particularly in a pandemic where one of the most affordable options is to wash your hands. So the confluence of all of those events together, I think, has had a devastating impact on Native American communities. And in addition to that, I think this documentary was very good at showing the social isolation, the inability in a community that's usually very close to each other to be able to sort of go to someone's house, to physically hug them and be with them. I think that physical isolation really took a toll, particularly on elderly members in the community. So it's a great documentary. I'll try to find it and send it to you if you email me. But I think it really articulates really well and very visually the impacts that it's been having in these communities.
All right. Please keep the questions coming. There are two that are related. They both deal with rights, and I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to elide the two of them. First, a lot of effort is being spent to advance climate justice claims through a rights framework at both the international and domestic levels. Do you think these rights-based frameworks are likely to be effective in challenging the economic structures which give rise to climate injustice? And then a related question, a little bit more specific. What are the pros and cons of framing this as a children's rights issue, as a children's rights as human rights issue? Secondly, another framing issue is One Health. What are your thoughts on this? I would just add my own thoughts. I actually worked on the Kane case, which is in Massachusetts, which is Kane against DEP, which is both the Patrick administration and the Baker administration, which was interpreting the Global Warming Solutions Act as a nice idea rather than binding targets. The court, very fortunately, the Supreme Judicial Court held the opposite. But the plaintiffs in that case, as in many, many others, as in the Juliana litigation, are all young people.
Mm-hmm.
These are the US citizens that are the analog of Greta Thunberg. So what do you think of rights as a framing device for moving us forward on climate?
I think it depends on the country that you are in and where the litigation is brought. So I think that the rights-based issue was very successful in the Netherlands in the Urgenda case. And so the European Convention on Human Rights was used quite successfully by the plaintiffs in that action. And I think that that will have a really progressive effect in European countries. I also think that it can be successful in some developing countries that have written constitutions and use environmental rights based as a human right. And so there's another great case in Pakistan, that the Ashgari case, where the judge found that the government was not doing enough and that this climate change was a huge impact on human rights. So I think in some countries it can be very successful. In the United States, I think it's proven to be less successful for a number of reasons, and partly because there are no environmental rights in terms of constitutional rights in the United States. And so that is a huge barrier. I think being able, so Juliana was a difficult decision because it was really about standing, which is related to not only who is suing, but what they were asking for. And so it failed on redressability grounds as opposed to having actual rights. But I suspect that the breadth of the claim also had to do with that as well. So we see a lot of youth claims. There have been a couple in Canada that have been launched recently, and they have had varying levels of success. I think it's obviously very important not only that people are young, but also, so for example, there's a claim in Quebec where they claim that we're all young and we're all going to suffer the impacts of climate change. And the judge was like, well, you can't show me anything tangible that you're going to experience. And how are you different from all the other people in the world who, that even though they might be old, when the impacts of climate change hit, will still be impacted. So I think while I think it's very important in terms of raising public awareness of climate change, and I think it's really important to galvanize young people onto the cause and also get them interested in law and some of the failings of law to deal with the issue of climate change, because the law has not been very successful in terms of providing avenues for climate litigation. But I think it really depends on where you sue. So the UN has been very clear that climate change will have impacts on human rights. I think internationally that has been recognized, but different court systems have, and different countries have different structures that are more or less amenable to a rights-based claim. And then in terms of One Health, obviously, some of the more successful claims have been based on the health impacts of climate change, so tangible, specific health impacts. And so there's one case in the administrative court in France. There have been a couple of French cases, so I hope I'm not confusing it, but I think it's the administrative court in France that allowed asylum to basically a climate refugee, even though that's not a proper legal term, but a claimant from, I want to say Pakistan, but that might be because I was just thinking about the Ashgari case, who claimed that the return to his country, because of the levels of air pollution, the impacts of climate change, would exacerbate his lung condition so significantly that he should not be returned. And the court actually agreed with that. And so found that since he had been living in France, his lung condition had improved significantly, and that the return would have a really significant effect on his health. And so I think the impacts of climate change that are related to health, in some instances, can be a really successful way to frame a claim.
All right, there is a pending question about students who might be interested in environmental law as a career. Let's leave that until the very end as a hopeful note, and also students can use. But in the meantime, is the growing awareness stroke political salience differentiated impacts within developed countries like the US likely to impact the international negotiating position of these developed countries? Is President Biden going to be ambitious on climate nationally and internationally? Then there's a second question, which is to what extent might the Clean Air Act be useful in addressing, we have a new nationally determined contribution coming up within days on Earth Day, April 22nd. To what extent is the existing legislation adequate? To what extent does it need to be changed, especially in a climate, no pun intended, of considerable legislative activity?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. So I think that environmental justice has finally, hopefully, made it onto the attention of um, a US administration. And so I think that the Biden administration, at least by what they have been saying, and in terms of parts of their plans for, I call it the infrastructure plan, but it's the American Jobs Plan, is very much focused on jobs, justice, and climate. And so the interlinkages between those, and President Biden has talked about fence line communities, environmental justice communities, and how that is very much related to both economic justice and climate justice. And so I think that the plans, at least, are, or the rhetoric, at least, is to pay much more attention to environmental justice communities, and that is necessarily linked to climate justice. And so a lot of these communities are suffering the impacts of fossil fuels and the siting of fossil fuel facilities. And so it's definitely on the agenda. How, and there's been some great appointments, I have to say. There's just been some amazing appointments to the EPA on energy justice, in particular, Shalonda Baker, Professor Baker. So just some great appointments of people that really sort of understand this issue and are have the skills to really, hopefully, successfully execute plans around it. So the piece that I'm not really sure about is the question is whether or not these communities will impact the negotiating strategy of the United States in the international arena. And the answer to that is I really don't know. So there will definitely be progress, hopefully, on the domestic front around these issues. And there are big plans through the budget reconciliation process, I guess, for the America Jobs Plan. But whether or so, John Kerry is the special advisor and was led the High Ambition Coalition for as the part of the United States in the Paris negotiations, and that coalition was hugely important in actually getting the 1.5 degree temperature goal even included in the Paris Agreement, because that was a really hard push just to get the inclusion of that reference in the Paris Agreement. And that really only happened because of the High Ambition Coalition. So the small island states were a huge part of that as well. So that's hopeful because he has a lot of experience with international negotiations and knows what the big issues are. Whether or not those issues of climate justice domestically make it into the negotiations, I don't know. And I say that because even under the Obama administration, when I would go to negotiations, the US was a difficult negotiating partner, even in a really progressive administration. And so it didn't necessarily lead to improved climate finance, a willingness to really talk about the impacts of loss and damage for vulnerable countries. Climate migration was like a toxic subject in the room. You really even couldn't talk about it. They didn't even want to mention it, or not, never mind put it in an agreement. So I don't know what's going to happen. I'm hopeful, as I remain hopeful, but I'm really not sure if it will impact the negotiating position of the United States. I will say, however, that separate and apart from national negotiations are other interested parties like Indigenous communities, like young people they have their own sort of separate representation. By that, I mean, they go to the negotiations, they provide interventions on the floor, not sort of after all the states have spoken. And so there are pressure groups that are there at the negotiations. They really put forward their position. Unfortunately, a lot of countries don't listen to them. But they are there and they will continue to be there. And I suspect that a number of vulnerable communities around the world will form part of that. And I'm hopeful that the next COP will be a successful one. Did I miss a part of that question? Oh, the Clean Air Act. Okay, yeah, okay. Domestic legislation. So that's a really difficult issue. I don't know that we'll get any amendments to the Clean Air Act. I think the question probably is there going to be new rules promulgated under the Clean Air Act? I've heard really differing opinions about this. Obviously, the Clean Power Plan is not going to be resurfaced in its current form. And so I'm really not sure what the EPA is going to do about promulgating a new rule. Some people have said, yes, they should really go for it. I've heard other people say it's actually super time consuming to do that. It takes a really long time and a lot of agency talent and effort to put together that kind of regulation. And then it will, more likely than not be challenged. And then, of course, with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's really doubtful what will happen if it is challenged. So I've heard people say it's not worth it. Basically, it's not worth the time and effort, and let's try and do it through another process, like infrastructure, for example. So I've not come down one way or the other on that. I'm really uncertain about whether or not that's the best way to proceed with the current makeup of the Supreme Court.
Right. And just as an aside, from one of your faculty members, namely myself, the Boston College, this is a presentation to the entire university, not just the law school, although I'm a law professor. And Boston College, the university, is about to be accredited to the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. Lisa, you're probably already on your way there. You probably already have your ticket. But this is new for us, and keep your eyes on the conference of the parties, and we are hoping to send a delegation consisting of primarily students and faculty as well. So you may very well have the opportunity to participate yourself in these discussions and to see them firsthand. Okay, next question, which is actually related to the previous one. What are your thoughts on the framing of climate finance as reparations rather than assistance? And let me expand that somewhat to deal with the question of liability and what in the biz goes as the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. If that doesn't mean anything to you, not to worry. I'm sure you got the basic idea. But the real question is, to what extent is financial compensation, as opposed to financial assistance for, say, adaptation, to what extent is that an appropriate part of the multilateral climate package?
I think it's an appropriate way to talk about it. And in fact, within negotiators, we often talk about among ourselves about compensation, but it's not going to help in terms of getting anything agreed in terms of changing the name of it. So compensation for loss and damage, as I call it, or climate finance, as other people call it, is highly contentious, and it's always contentious, and it's always one of the last things to be agreed. And the language around climate finance is always very, very vague and non-committal by design. And so, as David has said, what happened, there's this sort of general climate finance section in all the COP decisions and in the Paris Agreement itself. And then what we did in the Paris Agreement, and by we I mean AOSIS really, some of the really brilliant AOSIS negotiators worked very, very hard to have a separate article in the Paris Agreement called loss and damage. And what had happened is that there's this concept of negation, which you reduce your emissions, and then adaptation is how do you basically adapt to the impacts, negative impacts of climate change. And people came up with this term loss and damage, and it took really years of talking about it, talking to our partners in the negotiations about what we meant by loss and damage. And what people mean by loss and damage is where you will have loss that is irreparable. And so if a coral reef, for example, bleaches and dies, you're not going to get that back. And then damage, which you could actually pay your way to recover from, but it's so expensive that it's really almost impossible for developing countries to do that. And so what we had, scientists had have identified this issue. The negotiators identified it from the science, basically saying that loss and damage is more than what we can adapt to. It exceeds our adaptation abilities. And that was a really hard concept to get included in the Paris Agreement. And the only way that we included it as a separate article of the Paris Agreement, separate and apart from adaptation, is our partners, mainly developed countries and some large developing countries who also don't want to be responsible for compensation for loss and damage, required that there was a paragraph in the accompanying COP decision. So the COP decision is a document that accompanies every COP, and it's of questionable legal bindingness, whereas the Paris Agreement's a treaty. And in that, there's a reference saying that this inclusion of a provision in the Paris Agreement on loss and damage does not mean or does not implicate any obligation, financial obligation for parties on loss and damage. And so that trade-off, I think, tells you a lot, that countries didn't even want to include a reference to loss and damage in the Paris Agreement without some exclusion of liability, basically. And that issue continues. So developed countries and large developing countries do not want to be financially responsible for the impacts of climate change that they are currently causing and historically have caused. It is one of the more sensitive parts of the negotiation. We make some progress over time. So the last COP 2 years ago did make some progress on the Warsaw mechanism, which is sort of a working group and a committee that's been established prior to the Paris Agreement and enshrined in the Paris Agreement to work on these issues of loss and damage, including migration, including finance. So largely the WIM, as we call it, has worked on task force and let's study the issue. And so, insurance is always, something that people talk about. You can insure your way out of adaptation and loss and damage, but, that's really us paying for the impacts of climate change that we didn't cause. So it's highly sensitive. I don't think that changing what we call it will make a difference. The concept itself is really difficult. So what you will get, I think, is some technology transfer, some assistance, some capacity building, that kind of stuff. And so that kind of climate assistance will be sort of packaged as part of climate finance. Parties do have to report what the amount of climate finance that they are providing to countries, and they have to put that in their nationally determined contribution. And so obviously, developing countries will be watching very carefully, vulnerable developing countries, of what countries say that they're doing and what they're actually doing. There's also the Green Climate Fund, which was agreed in 2010, and that is a specific institution that's supposed to allocate climate finance. And so parties are working on making that more accessible, particularly for small countries, but it's a really difficult issue.
Just as an aside on the insurability point, here within this country, the flood insurance program, the coastal flood insurance program, had to be taken over by the federal government because it's very difficult to establish an actuarial risk. And with the infrastructure that we have in this country, we cannot insure coastal properties and establish the difficulty is establishing an appropriate premium. How can we expect that to happen around the world? Also, Dr. Benjamin is too diplomatic to say this, but one of the principal states opposing loss and damage is the United States. I can tell you when I was working for the State Department and negotiating these sorts of agreements, the basic instructions that we got were, don't even think about it. Mm-hmm. So anything that had to do with liability. So this is very controversial, and there's a big agreement on hazardous waste with a liability protocol that still has not yet entered into force. It's one of the hardest questions. So thank you very much, Lisa. And we will one more, and we'll finish on an optimistic note as to, from a student considering environmental law, do you think that the practice of environmental law is a viable way to bring about actual substantial change and progress in our response to climate change and other issues relating to environmental justice? If not, what do you think is the best avenue to go? So we'll wrap up with that, and thank you very much.
Yeah, the easiest answer is yes, it is. Go for it. I will say that, and I tell this to my students all the time, I've been working in climate change for over 10 years now. And that's obviously related to environmental justice issues. And I think this is one of the more hopeful years that I've ever taught it in. We went through some dark periods, and it's definitely a challenging career to choose, but I think you can make a real difference. I think we absolutely need dedicated advocates who will work with environmental justice communities, who will work with climate vulnerable communities, who will really advocate with these communities for the things that they know that they need. I think it takes a different kind of lawyer, particularly for environmental justice, than you would normally think. I think community lawyering, which was on one of my first slides, knowing how to work with communities, not talk over communities, but work with communities to find out what they really need and what they want. They're the experts in their neighborhoods. They know what they're experiencing. They know what the companies are doing. They see them every day. And so that idea of community lawyering, I think, could be a remarkably rewarding career. I do think it makes a difference. Even though, it can be a really depressing picture in terms of the impacts of climate change, we've come a hugely long way, particularly in the past couple of years. I think that things will change dramatically. I really feel like we're on this sort of tipping point where energy systems can really change. The way that corporations look at climate change is really changing. And I think part of that is because social expectations of governments and companies are changing dramatically. They're partly changing because young people have a very different perspective. And I think that's really hopeful and important. And so I think it can be a really rewarding career. It's not easy. It takes a lot of determination and persistence, but I think that you can actually advocate and make real change, whether you work for communities in environmental justice or whether you work in the private sector, really pushing companies to make changes, or whether you work in the federal government, pushing governments to really make progressive changes. I think that you can make progress in all of those avenues. And I think that it's a really important way to spend your life.
And on that optimistic note, let's thank Professor Lisa Benjamin for a fantastic
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you so much. It's particularly useful for our students to hear the message that you have to deliver. And environmental justice truly is a different kind of lawyering than has been encountered in this field before, which is largely administrative law, largely statutory, what have you. So many thanks to Dr. Benjamin. The next speakers in this series are also paragons of environmental justice. Next, we have Gus Beth, a week from today at noon, April 22nd, actually on Earth Day. He's one of the founders of the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I got my start, and he has been the administrator of the UN Development Program and the dean of the School of Environment at Yale Law School. He's a seminal thinker in the field. Plus, it's Earth Day, noon. You should come. Phil Landrigan is moderating. And then a week after that, 6:00 p.m., we have Barry Hill, who's the former head of the Environmental Justice Office at the Environmental Protection Agency, terrific speaker, and somebody who was actually, like Dr. Benjamin, has actually worked in this field and can give you a firsthand perspective. So 2 more excellent speakers. Thanks, Lisa, for getting us off to such a terrific start. And I think we have no choice but to say goodbye.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise.